Woe to those who draw sin along with cords of deceit, and wickedness as with cart ropes. To those who say, "Let God hurry, let him hasten his work so we may see it, the plan of the Holy One of Israel. Let it approach, let it come into view so we may know it." Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and champions at mixing drinks, who acquit the guilty for a bribe, but deny justice to the innocent.
Thank you, Jerry. I think one of the questions that we all wrestle with as Christians is what to do with large parts of the Old Testament. On the one hand, we would look at some passages and say because the prophecies have been fulfilled, because the law was completed in Christ, because Jesus honored a lot of those things and fulfilled those things, some parts of it are not binding on us in the sense that it was binding on people, the Jewish people in the Old Testament. But at the same time, we know that the Old Testament books have a very prominent place throughout the New Testament. We're getting ready today to start this series on Isaiah. I would point out that Isaiah is quoted 83 times in the New Testament. So I think if you were to talk to the early church, they would say there's no question that this is Christian scripture. This is something that matters to the church, that informs the church. I'm convinced that the New Testament wasn't given to us so that we could suddenly chop our Old Testaments out of our Bible and just discard them. But instead, I want to make the case that in a lot of different places, the New Testament and Old Testament each will defer to one another. They each seem to value one another. One of the things we're going to be doing in our communion devotionals as we're working through this series is that we're going to be looking at passages in Isaiah that kind of point towards the Messiah and think about Jesus in light of the things that were predicted about Jesus. What's kind of interesting in the way that a lot of the New Testament writers quote Isaiah is that they tend to quote a lot of the more obscure passages. But when we would say, like, what's the most Christ-centered passage in Isaiah, most of you, even if you don't know it by chapter number, Isaiah chapter 53, it reads like an eyewitness account of the crucifixion. It is so profound, yet it is also unquoted in the New Testament in reference to Jesus. I would make the case that, again, I think sometimes Old Testament writers and New Testament writers assume that we're looking at each of the other ones. So, for example, 1 Peter talks about the way that some of the Old Testament prophets were getting glimpses of things that God was doing and was going to do. They were getting glimpses of it, but they couldn't fully see it, and they knew that it was going to have to come at a later time that we could really understand all that God was up to. The prophets would long to look into things, however, they had to deal with things in their own time, in their own setting. And so in that sense, they would have to defer to the New Testament to complete the things that they didn't have available to them. But at the same time, I would argue that some of these passages in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, we might see a snippet or a reference to it. But the assumption is that, Isaiah chapter 53 is already worded so beautifully, I don't need to say it again because I defer to what Isaiah already said. The assumption being, we as Christians ought to know our entire Bible, not just 5 or 6 verses that we like to quote to ourselves. We want to know the whole counsel of God. So as we're getting started, this is going to be kind of an introductory lesson to the book of Isaiah, and we're going to be looking at a real big picture of Isaiah today. I wanted to talk briefly about my understanding of the way that prophets worked. Most often when we talk about prophets, we're thinking about someone kind of predicting the future, and they positively do that. But a lot of times the way that they're predicting the future is rooted in covenants that they've already made with God. So a prophet very often was a person not just telling you a bunch of bizarre things that you've never imagined, but instead saying, you remember when God gave you this land and God gave you this kingdom and God delivered you from slavery and God gave you all these nice things? Remember how God said that if you'd stay faithful to him, he'd keep blessing you? But if you just got busy worrying about yourself and you forgot about God, you decided to live your life as if God didn't exist, God's going to let you feel what it's like to not have him as involved in your kingdom and not giving you all those blessings that you're so used to. So many prophecies are a message kind of like that. Remember what God said, and if you don't take what God said seriously, there are consequences for turning your back on God. But the good news is, if you turn back to God with a sincere heart, he'll still receive you. Looking at the prophetic books and most of the contents of them, it doesn't seem that many of the prophets would generally preach like the way that I'm preaching right now, where you assume each week I'm going to have a spot and I'm going to talk 25, 30 minutes, something like that. If you look at the actual contents of their messages, it seems that prophets would have been much more like street preachers. You know, you see examples of Jesus in the early church, even there teaching in the temple courts. It seems that a lot of times the prophets would have this role of challenging the people. And so as people are walking in and out of the city or the temple, they would stand there and have to kind of harangue them a little bit and say, hey, God's given me this message, and if you don't pay attention, this could happen. But you think of the way that news tickers work, that thing that keeps scrolling at the bottom of the screen. It seems that some of their messages may have been fairly short, but something they would stand there and repeat maybe a few different times as people would listen to them, or perhaps to another prophet. There were often more than one around. And so they would give these simple messages. We also know that occasionally the prophets would collect some of the things they've been teaching. In fact, both Isaiah and Jeremiah will talk about on occasion where I've had several different things that God has told me, several different messages that I've given to the people, and so now I've compiled those. I would argue that the first good chunk of Isaiah is really just a collection of some of the little shorter messages he'd been preaching along the way. But frankly, the part of the importance of brevity was some of the stuff they were preaching was likely to get them arrested. So that passage that Jerry just read for us, can you imagine someone standing there and accusing the people out in public? Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who trade light for dark. I mean, really challenging the people. Sometimes the prophets did end up arrested and mistreated in a lot of different ways. Another thing we seem to understand about the way that prophets worked is that there may well have been schools of prophets. So when you think about the characters of Elijah and Elisha and also Samuel, we know in all three cases there were little communities of people who had these prophecies from the Lord who, we don't know if they always lived together, but certainly they were in regular contact with one another. And they would kind of share in this work together. So you might remember that scene where Elijah's getting ready to be taken up into heaven and Elisha's supposed to be there to see it so he can get a double portion. You might remember on that occasion one of the schools of the prophets showed up and they all said, hey, you know, today's the day that Elijah's going to be taken up. So we see God moving through multiple people in this kind of role. I also think this has some significance as we look at the book of Isaiah and how it was finally formed. Some of the latter parts of Isaiah, we wonder, did he write these himself, or was this part of an ongoing community who was faithful to his message, who helped to collect some of these ideas? I'll talk about that more in just a moment. Okay, so now it's time for my big visual aid. So Peyton, and I think he's got a few of the teens lined up, so whichever you said you would do this, I need you to come up and help us out real quick. So really, a really fun way to study the Bible, if you want to get a good sense for the context of a book, a good way to do it is to try and print out the book. And you know, a New Testament epistle, you can stick 4 or 5 pages together and get the whole thing. Isaiah was a little bit more daunting, right? So 66 chapters long, and I appreciate everybody's help keeping this up here. And remember to bend your knees. We don't need anybody passing out while you're here. So what I wanted to try and do, yeah, y'all need to scoot down a little bit more on this end. He's still got a little more to go. Yeah, keep going, keep going. Yeah. So this is quite a bit to take in. So what I wanted to do today, I'm going to point out a few things about the way that this book flows to help us appreciate kind of the driving points that Isaiah is trying to make. Over here in this first section, these are kind of his earliest teachings, and he's writing during the time of King Ahaz. So this is early in Isaiah's ministry. King Ahaz is a wicked king in the southern kingdom. At the time, the kingdom's divided into north and south, and there's a lot of wickedness in both places. And so part of what's going on here is that he's having to challenge the people of Israel on their unfaithfulness to God. But then he's also offering some hope, and he's speaking as well to the Assyrians, because they're going to be taking over with their empire, and there's some accountability that has to take place. So moving from there, this next section is where God is talking to a lot of the different nations. So from chapter 13 down to chapter 23, these are a lot of messages for imperial powers. And so we're kind of collectively referring to them as Babylon, but this is where God's going to start calling out several of the different nations. Moving from there, you get to this section in chapter 24 down to 27 where he starts envisioning a new world. When you think about injustice and crime, hate crimes, terrorists, the treachery of some of these empires as they would take over, one of the thoughts that we all have when we see pure evil in the world is, surely there's someone who can redeem this world and do something better. That's kind of the idea that encapsulates this section where God's dealing with all the corruption and all the terrible things that happen, and then he gives Isaiah this vision that surely there could be something a little better for us somewhere. Moving from that section, we start kind of a second similar cycle. So here, starting in chapter 28, we have challenge and hope for Judah, and then once again, trouble for Assyria. But whereas we started with King Ahaz, this time we're talking about the time of King Hezekiah. Hezekiah was one of the very few good kings in Israel's history. He's a king in the southern kingdom just as Ahaz was, but whereas Ahaz was unfaithful to God and it led to punishment, Hezekiah is going to be faithful to God, and it's going to lead to a time of blessing. And in fact, once you get around chapter 36, this is where Isaiah stops being kind of that prophetic, poetic stuff, and it becomes a narrative story. So you may remember that story about the Assyrian king who came and threatened Hezekiah and said, I'm going to take over your city, Jerusalem. Don't you be stupid and try and defend yourself, because if you don't believe me, every other king has prayed to their God, and I've conquered all of them. I'm going to take you as well. And so there's a great story of Hezekiah turning to the Lord and saying, truthfully, I have nowhere else to turn. Either you're going to save us or we're going to die. And then God sends that angel to fight the Assyrian army on Israel's behalf. It's a great story. That's found here in Isaiah. There's a really different tone that starts happening around chapter 40. And this is the passage where people wonder, is Isaiah writing this himself, or is this maybe the community kind of continuing some of the things he had taught about? But starting in Isaiah chapter 40, this is after the kingdom has been conquered and the people are in exile. So they've lost Jerusalem, they feel hopeless, they don't have their own land or territory or temple anymore. And he begins with the words, comfort, comfort my people. So he's speaking in a present tense to people who are actively now driven out of the kingdom, who have lost so much. As we get to this last section, just like we saw before, there's this hope for a new world. There's something new envisioned at the end of Isaiah, much like it had been envisioned here at the last of this episode with King Ahaz. So you see there's kind of a repeating pattern in the book as it moves forward. So one of the things I wanted to do with this, I don't know how well you can see some of the colors on the document. I'm going to get to that last section in a minute, but one of the things that's helpful to do, if you read through a book of the Bible, if you were to print something out, again, New Testament epistles are much easier to do than this one was, but, you can read through the Bible and just read it for certain themes, read it looking through a certain lens. So I wanted to show you the way that a few themes emerge in this book that kind of inform the way that we apply it. One of the colors that, if we go to that next slide, Blake. So if we could start with that first theme, one of the themes that shows up a lot of times in the book of Isaiah, the ones that you see that are in orange, these are passages where God is referred to as fire, or his judgment is referred to as something fiery. So when he's in a period of having to kind of threaten their behavior, you'll see lots of this orange color showing up as I've highlighted it, where God is having to hold them accountable. Something kind of related to that is passages that you see highlighted in yellow, where God is talking about the way he wants to offer us wisdom. And that's an offer that he's always making. If you would only listen to me, I would give you a better path. I would give you a better way, if only you would listen. So you'll see little bits of yellow throughout the document, and those yellow and orange colors are sometimes intermingled. The other color that we wanted to focus on here is this blue. When you see the color blue, this is referring to God's holy mountain. Mount Zion. Very often God returns to this theme because his vision of Zion and Jerusalem were that people would be able to come there. It would be this place that God was always worshiped, that people could find wholeness, that they could find cleansing and healing. And so, for instance, if you look at this early section, you see some talk about the mountain of the Lord. You see it showing up again later, but you also see it here interspersed with this green color. The green color is the missional emphasis of Isaiah. So very often you'll see God, when he's speaking in green here, he's talking about the nations. I think sometimes we miss out on that when we read the Old Testament. We just kind of talk about the Old Testament as being all doom and gloom, and we talk about, the Great Commission as if that were the first time God ever thought about evangelism. But I would argue every time you see the color green on here, what you see God saying is, I want so much for all these nations to find their way home to me. I want to see all people be able to come into my kingdom and be part of this blessed people that are mine. He's always loved all the foreign nations. And so to kind of watch what happens thematically here at the beginning, you have some of the orangey judgment stuff going on, but then you have God talking about, I want everyone to come to my holy mountain. I'm thinking of all the nations I wish to see. And because of that, God therefore has to judge the people for the ways that they've been slacking off. And as you move through this section, you see some of the same kinds of challenges where God's having to judge the people, he's having to punish them for disobedience, but at the same time, he's still got this hope of what it is they would become. The red color is where stuff starts to get really interesting. All the passages that I've highlighted in this pinkish, reddish color, these are passages where God is talking about his servant. That is a really big theme in Isaiah. He's continuing to talk about the servant of the Lord. The servant who would actually be faithful. The servant who would do the things that would honor God and not to shame God. And it's here, once they're in Babylonian captivity, remember this is where it's kind of a later part of the story. It's once they've lost their kingdom that everyone starts looking towards a Messiah. So you see how that red color suddenly starts popping out once you get to these later sections? This is where they start talking more and more about this servant of the Lord and the things that he could do. There's kind of a harsh realization that I think they have to have as a people and that each of us has to have as a person. Whereas we've had times of obedience, we've had times of disobedience. Left to our own devices, we make bad choices and we suffer the consequences of those choices, which ultimately leads us to start trying to find somewhere to put our hope. So as a nation, as we move to this period of time, they start thinking and looking more and more towards someone who could deal with all their shortcomings. It was always intended, the earlier passages that reference the servant of the Lord are supposed to be talking about Israel. Israel, the nation, was supposed to be the servant of the Lord, who followed the law of the Lord, who reached out to all the Gentiles in the nations and taught them the true way of faith. They were supposed to be that servant, but they just kept failing at it. And they weren't doing it up to God's standards, not to his glory. And so eventually they start looking to one who really could be that servant, who could fulfill all the things that they were supposed to fulfill. So there's this shift, but ultimately all of this book, as we pointed out, there's kind of a pattern that moves through it, but all of the book is moving here towards this last section beginning in chapter 56. I think you may remember a couple of weeks ago we talked about the book of Lamentations, and I talked about the concept of a chiasm, a poem that has symmetry to it, where you kind of have things moving towards the middle, and the middle part forms kind of a bullseye, which is an area of most importance. So what happens in the book of Isaiah is that everything is moving towards this last section. We start really hoping for the Messiah to come. And then we get down to chapter 56. And if you can see, I think I've got it on the screen there as well. I hope it's slightly visible. But on the ends here, I've got a darker blue color. And as it starts moving towards the middle, the darker blue color is talking again about foreigners in the service of God. So he's thinking about those outside the kingdom. How can they make their way into the kingdom? Moving from the blue into this blue-green color, these are the sections where God is talking about the community of faith, saying, we need those outsiders to become insiders, but we've got some serious stuff we've got to deal with. There are some things that the people have got to repent of if this is going to be accomplished. Moving from that into the light green color, the light green color contains passages of prayers. So the nation reaches out to God and prays and says, would you please restore us and bring us back? Would you restore your presence to us? and that is followed by the orange colors. And in the orange colors, it's describing God. In fact, there's a great passage here where Paul will draw on it in Ephesians about the armor of God. The armor of God comes from Isaiah, where he says, I'm going to put on my helmet and my breastplate, and I'm going to act. So those orange passages are where God takes action. And then we get to the red passages, and the red passages are the ones that describe the ideal city, everything restored, everything the way that it's supposed to be. But ultimately, all of this is moving towards the bullseye in this chiasm, the middle piece of this symmetry. I made it a pink color. So when you think about all the weight of all these years, of all the kingdoms, of captivity, and all the things they've gone through, the hope of the Messiah, it's all leading up to that one passage. Can I read it for you? This is the very center of the message of Isaiah. It says, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn." You remember that passage? When Jesus began his ministry, he stood there in the synagogue and he asked for the scroll of Isaiah, and he went to that very passage and read it and said, "Today, in your hearing, this is fulfilled." So we think about the presence of Jesus, what he represents, the hope of Israel to someone who could finally be the servant of the Lord. Jesus is the one who comes in and fully embodies the hope of this great book and many others like it. So I wanted to point that out, and I want us to think a little bit about the way that history works. You ever had anyone tell you that history repeats itself? Do you believe that? I do. There are a lot of ways in which history moves in kind of a circular motion. In fact, we can even see that here with Isaiah, don't we? I mean, we have some of the challenges, we have the calamity, and then visions of a new world, and then that pattern repeats itself once again. There's some ways we can talk about history in a circular fashion, that nations kind of swing back and forth in the ways that they think about things. I mean, it isn't coincidental that every time there's some kind of awful thing that happens to the nation, I think for me in my lifetime it would have been September 11th, 2001, church attendance was booming the following Sunday, was it not? All of a sudden we had to think very seriously about what mattered in life. So sometimes there are periods and cycles of things that move around and come back to us over time. So we have things that move in a circular fashion, but it's also not the case that history is going nowhere, that everything is just moving around in a circle and it's always going to be worse or spiraling downward. Instead, one of the great hopes we see in this book is that history is actually moving somewhere, and our story is also moving somewhere. So we have circles, but we also have lines, things that are moving towards completion. I wanted to read one other passage from this beautiful section, thinking about the direction that all of us is trying to go. Isaiah says in Isaiah chapter 65, "See, I will create new heavens and a new earth. The former things will not be remembered, nor will they come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I will create. For I will create Jerusalem to be a delight and its people a joy. I will rejoice over Jerusalem and take delight in my people. The sound of weeping and crying will be heard in it no more." So as we think about our Christian hope, where everything is going, ultimately we're trusting that God is the one who does hold history in his hands and is controlling the direction that all things are moving, and that in Christ we are moving to that place of peace. That we're not just stuck in some kind of a spiral where we have brokenness and only more brokenness, but instead we can move from brokenness into wholeness, and ultimately to a place of blessing. So as each of us thinks about our own life this morning, I would just invite you to think about those things in your life that have become negative cycles, those patterns you keep repeating, and what is it that you need to reclaim for God to start moving forward again in the direction that God is calling you. If you guys would like to lay that face up down on the stage, I really appreciate your help getting that up here this morning. Can we have a hand for our volunteers? I know I made them tired, so thank you guys. But this is our opportunity where if you have some kind of a special need in your life or some way that you need to respond to God this morning, we're happy to assist you with that. But if you need to do that, we would invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing this song.